about the, you know, leadership with a capital L and leadership with a lowercase l. Again, I think when we were in Century Ferry, the young people that we met, amazing, just amazing. And for me, as I am at this the last trimester of my life, just that piece of the individuals who are the leaders, the individuals who have the knowledge, who have the energy to do so. And again, this is prior to George Floyd and all the different rallies and protests that happened last summer. But that the young people are the individuals who need to move forward. And so that's what I saw over there. I saw, I don't even know, I mean, I know that there's so many black folks that are so bright and so, you know, geniuses. And being able to actually experience that, Mustafa, being able to, he was like quoting the Quran like backwards, I think. I'm like, who does that? It's not, and he wasn't kind of Rain Man-ish either. Not that there's anything wrong with people who are on the spectrum, but just that whole piece of just being very personable, but have this expanse of knowledge and how he was working with young people, and helping them as far as building their capacity as well as their education, the software that existed there in the library, and then I met a young woman who recognized and saw that there was sexual assault happening in her family and, you know, just in the community. And so she'd taken it upon herself to create, you know, a model and almost not so much a nonprofit, but comparable to that, and to take action so that she can help to protect the vulnerable in her community and bring that to light. And so seeing that piece of individuals who see that there's a need and step up and make sure that those needs are met, and not necessarily having all kinds of resources or applying for grants or this or that, but just actually, you know, that rolling up their sleeves and the sweat equity and putting in the time and putting in the effort and making it happen. You know, those are, you know, you may think of them as small leaders, but they're big leaders because that's how the change happens. And those are the lives that are, they're able to impact the lives of the individuals around them, which will make all the difference in the world. So that's what I saw, and, you know, it just kind of reiterated that piece. If we look back at our civil rights history, you know, both Malcolm and Martin were killed at 39, and we think of all the activity and all the work that they did, you know, and again, that's one example. There are many, many others, again, that were maybe behind the scenes that we haven't had the opportunity to learn about as far as the formal activities that they engaged in, because that history has been kept from us intentionally. But again, the things that they did and all the things that helped to bring people together and to lead them and to help them to understand what they needed to do and to hold America and its system accountable, you know, and they were young. They died, they weren't even 40. So just that piece of, it is the young people who have the energy, who start out as maybe small leaders and end up as bigger leaders. I'll step down from that. I'm excited as far as what's on the floor in these upcoming years. So,
yeah. So when I think about leadership, I think about people who are willing to do what needs to be done, even if no one is necessarily following them. They're blazing a trail. They see something prophetically. They haven't not necessarily been able to articulate it or put their fingers on it, but they know that this is direction. It's like a leading and a guiding by the Spirit, by the divine, that's pushing you out some way, even if it doesn't make sense, even if you don't have resources, even if no one else is following yet. I think in the West, we've been taught to believe that leadership always means followers, and I don't think that's always necessarily the case. I think throughout our history as Black people, there have been people who have blazed trails, and there have not always been people behind them, people who didn't believe in them, people who doubted them, but they still went with that unction from what I call the Holy Spirit to do what needed to be done. So I think that understanding of leadership has only been refined more since coming back from Ghana. When I think about Dr. Tyner and what she's trying to do, she's blazing a trail. She is seeing something that people can't see with the natural eye. She's seeing it in the spirit and understanding that as a people, as a community, this is where we need to go. And not everyone has bought into that vision, and that's fine, because I think in time, as it continues to unfold, we'll be able to see what she's been seeing for so long. And so when I think of leadership, again, just that insight, that foresight, it's not necessarily popularity, it's not necessarily charisma. I think those things get conflated with what leadership is. It's not. People believe the hype, and that's not what leadership is either. It's, you have to get things done, but you also have to see where other people can't see.
Well, what I think about now is how to lead in the spirit of my people. And I think for so long you learn different concepts from different folks, and you try to do things like they would do that. And now I feel that I reach inside more. I find comfort in what I see with my friends and the way they lead, and I don't know, it made me feel a little bit more innovative, creative.
I think leadership starts with the individual. Leading yourself because you have the moral authority to do what is right and reject what is wrong. And I think out of that, a man can lead his home, and I don't say that to minimize the wife or the mother of the house, but you know, that's where it starts. And I think the best example you set by leadership is by how you live, because you can't ask people to do what you're not willing to do in order to, you know, provide that that leadership to them. And I think one of the other things, getting back to leadership, it starts with, especially with our young people, should start at a young age, and getting back to that young brother and sister that was able to fill that void. And if they was able to be taught and trained and nurtured to do that, fill that void in that capacity, I'm sure they could have done it in other capacities in absence of the mother or the father not you know, not being there. And I think one of the other things that comes to mind is when we look back at our history, there's always been someone who was willing to step up. I'm sure every ship that came over here, there was someone that stepped up. And going all the way back to the very beginning, when the first ship came, there was someone that stepped up and had a plan to try to keep the folks together, keep them mindful of what they left, keep them mindful of their history, their culture, and their faith. And I think where we lose sight on that is going from one generation to the next. And you know, just like when we talk about all the leaders we've had in the past and how we were connected and everything, and now the revolution of the 60s was the revolution of the 70s over in Africa and so forth, we don't have that. We just seem to be in a confused state. When we look even at the economic part of it, when I look at the Southeast Asians, Vietnam was in a tremendous war. We dropped bombs and bombs on them for I don't know how long. Almost destroyed the country, north and south. And when the folks left Vietnam and came over to this country and other parts of the Western world, they reconnected to the Vietnamese back home. And as a result of that, every store you go in, you buy something that's from Vietnam. And it's because of their reconnection. And I think that part of our leadership in reconnecting our economic system back to Africa has truly been missing. And we should have all these products, just like the Vietnamese have, not just in their store, but in Costco's and other stores. They've been able to bring all that back, and now Vietnam is one of the top economies, you know, in the world. And they say when you go over there, you won't even know that there was a war not too long ago. And so hopefully we can, you know, we can rebuild on that.
Yeah. Okay. I think speaking of leadership too, I agree with all of that, and I also go into Senchi Ferry and understanding tribal government and kingdom government, and that there are people who they didn't lose their kingdoms, and so to understand that whoever, we are descended from people who resisted even in the midst of enslavement, that there have been kingdoms that have continued on for time, you know, and so to meet the king and to hear his story, and the king of Senchi Ferry, like, he was a resistant king. He ran away the first time they tried to nominate him as king, right. And he came to America. And it's like, you know, that leadership is for a time and it can be for everybody, but at that point he wasn't ready. And so I think to understand that you don't always have to step into leadership because someone else assumes you should, I think was a key message for me. And I think the other piece is that the king is chosen in that kingdom by the Queen Mother and her council of ladies. And so, you know, that she spoke about the fact that this council of women, like the throne really belonged to the women, you know, and that sense of like pride in their womanhood and femaleness, and knowing that that's a responsibility for them. But it's also a privilege, you know, that they take very seriously. So I think that for me was key. And I think the other thing, you know, is just going back to those community leaders and that sense of when you see something in your community that needs to be handled, you handle it. You know, they also had like nanas, which were like male leaders. And so the reverence you give to your nana is like, you know, again, it was those kind of connections for me that made me think of home, you know, because when my great grandparents were living, you know, they were like the nanas. Like if something happened, you went to them and they figured it out, they mediated it, they celebrated it, whatever it was. And so I think too, that sense of that connection still came over the ocean. And I think, you know, being in the environment I am now and like away from my family to some degree, I feel like as a community, we've kind of lost that. But you could really see it there, like in that community, like everybody knew when we showed up, they knew we were coming, you know, like they did this welcome for us. Yeah, it was that whole sense of like, yeah, like your people care about you and they're an ocean away and they're still ready to welcome you. So
I think I'll go back to one of our early trips together with Selma for the anniversary march. And I remember I was struggling. Before we went on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, everyone was singing, "We Shall Overcome." I'm like, I would never teach my kids the lyrics. Because internally, I feel like it's something about my own human dignity as a woman and a woman of color that I was born with this ability to, one, overcome, and it was my birthright. Now, there are, of course, impediments that are on the way that make it a bit of a challenge and why we sing songs like "We Shall Overcome." But looking at the verse that oftentimes we don't talk about is, "We are not afraid." So I think the experience of going to Ghana, especially in being in the Akwamu traditional land, learning more about the cultural heritage and many of the triumphs of the Akwamus and how they took back the keys from the castle in Christiansburg, those are the stories we never learn. We always learn those stories that we had to be afraid, we had to be scared, or we had to, you know, wait for somebody else to lead our change. But traveling to Ghana and having the experience really activated something in me that we are not afraid. We're not afraid to do the work, to challenge the narratives. We're not afraid to rebuild, recreate, reimagine. So moving out of a space where I think most of the time we find ourselves in, fear of the unknown, but really stepping into a new space of we are not afraid, and not being afraid of our own potential, not being afraid of the possibilities of what we can create. Because when you're going to Ghana, you're going to some of the most darkest experiences in history. Those chains that you see, a bondage, I mean, there's nothing else, it's unimaginable. But yet, even in the midst of that, to say that we're not afraid, to say that we have a purpose, we have a commitment, and to say that we're not going to let anything turn us back around, that now we have the responsibility to write the next chapters of history, I think Ghana changes your perspective in life. Or at least it did for me.
Well, I would say that a leader is someone that lives a life that others want to follow. They have an example that others want to follow. And so we saw a number of leaders who had done that in Africa. They did things that made others want to follow them. Like my husband mentioned, Kwame Nkrumah. He was the kind of leader that after he was deposed, they cut his head off, but they made a statue and they said, well, we want to keep the head there. We want to keep the head there. They want to remember that he was deposed, but they want to remember that he was their leader. And he was their leader because he was willing to do what he did for the country of the continent of Africa. It wasn't just for Ghana, but he was reaching out to other nations as well, not just even America, but in South America, other places in the world. He was just trying to gather the intellect from all the nations around the world. And so I thought that was very powerful, that they said he was deposed, but we want to keep his head attached. We put a chain there and put the head to him and let them know he was deposed. We're not ashamed that he was deposed. We're proud that he was willing to stand up for his beliefs. And so it wasn't like he was hung. He was deposed, but we appreciate what he did in becoming a target for that end. And so that was very powerful to me, because my grandparents on both sides were born into slavery and were in America. I appreciated the last door experience that we had, because I realized how much they had to experience, how much they had to suffer for me to enjoy the things that I've enjoyed today. And so the door of last return was a very important place for me. And my mother was such a storyteller. She told a story about her parents who were slaves in such a way that when Ancestry.com came along, I didn't really have to do much to put my past together. And she would always tell the story of her childhood and her parents' childhood as slaves. And she told the stories my dad didn't tell. My dad's parents were also born into slavery, but he never told the stories. And I think that told me that storytelling is important. Tell your children the stories. My mother told the stories. My dad never told the stories. And what I know about my grandparents on my dad's side, I learned from my mother, who learned from her husband, who was my dad. But my children took a trip with me this past year. I may have already said this, I don't know. And we were able to find my grandmother's gravesite. But the next trip we want to find my dad's parents. And that's going to be a journey I'm looking forward to. But it was just important to see that telling stories mattered to me, and it mattered to those children, because they were really trying to learn about the history through us even.
Leadership is not a foreign concept for me, as I had a father who was an example of leadership, and the one thing that I know about leadership is that we have to be servant leaders. We have this notion in the U.S. that leadership is, there's this person that seems to have more intelligence than the rest of us, and that we should be obedient to this individual. That is not a sign of leadership to me. And the one thing that I've learned, not only here but also on the continent, is that a leader is humble. And as a matter of fact, the more successes they're able to have, the more humble they are in terms of their service to their people. So one of the greatest examples, and a person who I've been a student of for a very long time, was Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, which was, he was the first president of a independent Ghana in 1957. And not only did Nkrumah help in terms of the freedom of Ghana, but his vision was one in terms of helping in terms of the freedom of all people of African descent. And one of his greatest contributions was to help black people all over the world see that we were African people, which is a very, very important concept. And including those that were north of the Sahara, who did not see themselves as African people. And so if we look in Minnesota, and it's really funny in terms of being in Minnesota, because, you know, on the one hand, Minnesota is so white, but within this whiteness, we have some of the most dynamic leaders here, probably in here than any place in the country. But what's even more powerful is that we have powerful black women leaders. We see it in Artika. We see it in Nakima Levy-Armstrong. We see it in so many sisters that are out here leading by example. And so there's a mantra that's going on that is catching on in terms of follow black women leaders. And so when we went to the continent, we could see that there were so many women that were part of this leadership, that in terms of the economy ran as a result of women leadership in Ghana, the collectives that they had, in terms of the food, in terms of so many areas. After our trip, I stayed with a family a week later, and there was a sister who started, that I stayed with. She started her own little business where she was loaning like 100 CDs to different families for them to start their own little businesses. And so she was so smart about it that everything she received, she would put it right back into the business. And so the piece for me, whether I look right here where I live or I look on the continent, I see that our leadership has to be about service, and that service doesn't come in terms of these totally great ideas that I have, but that they have to come in terms of what the people themselves say the needs are. So for me, leadership has to be one about that collective leadership in terms of the benefit of as many people as we possibly can reach. And so I see plenty of examples of that here, and I saw it absolutely every day when we were in Ghana.
You know, I think to almost piggyback on that, that leadership really comes from knowing who you are. And I think ancestrally, it's the stories that we know about our own personal lineage and the lineage of our people. And so making that connection to the area where you think your clan originally came from, and then understanding what they did to survive, to create me, right? And so, and then what that kind of, the legacy that that leaves in terms of leadership. So I think that identity and to know and to experience being there, standing on that walkway and thinking about the lives of those people that walked down that river's path and what happened to them. I think if you fast forward that, I mean, that is the lineage and the things that we have within us that I think makes us superior, actually. But also, knowing and understanding and having experienced that then makes you, I don't know, want to be better, want to do more, and want to recognize. And for me, it's always been about how do we recognize that societies and cultures and that people have led themselves outside of these models of leadership that we look at, right? And how do we recreate those individual leaders? Because there's leadership happens in all kinds of ways. You know, you lead your life, you lead your family, you lead your community. I mean, it happens without the notoriety of being somebody and being commemorated, because we all just have to lead ourselves and our lives and make things happen.